All right. Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
This time, we're going to be digging into something really meaty.
Yeah.
I'm excited about this one. We're talking about presidential power.
Oh, always a juicy topic.
Always.
Okay.
Right. And specifically, we're going to focus on two ideas, two concepts that they're closely related, but they're also kind of distinct.
Right.
And that's executive privilege and executive immunity.
Yeah, two of the biggest tools in the presidential toolbox.
Exactly. And we've got a really fascinating set of legal excerpts that you sent over. And I gotta say, some of this stuff is really, really juicy.
Oh, yeah. We're going to be unpacking some real-world controversies here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking Watergate, we're talking Clinton, so much to cover. And I think, by the end of this deep dive, our listeners are going to really understand not just what these legal terms mean, but like how they actually play out in the real world.
Yeah, we're not just going to be throwing around legal jargon here.
No, absolutely not. We're going to try to make this as clear and as engaging as possible.
Right. I think it's important to understand that these concepts aren't just abstract legal theories. They have real consequences for how our government functions.
Absolutely. And they're at the heart of some of the biggest debates about presidential power and accountability.
Right.
So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
All right. So first up, let's talk about executive privilege.
Okay.
Now imagine you're the president, right? You're facing some incredibly complex issue.
Mm-hmm.
You need to get advice from your advisors, from the smartest people around you. But those advisors are hesitant to speak their minds because they're worried about what might happen if their conversations become public.
Right.
And that's where executive privilege comes in.
Yeah, this idea that the president needs a certain degree of confidentiality to do their job effectively.
Exactly. It allows the president to keep certain communications confidential. And this can be anything from discussions about national security to advice on policy matters.
And, you can see why this would be important, right? You want to encourage open and honest communication between the president and their advisors.
Right. If advisors are constantly worried about being second-guessed or criticized, they might not give the best advice, or they might hold back crucial information.
Exactly. It's kind of like, doctor-patient confidentiality.
So that's a good analogy.
Yeah, you want your doctor to be able to give you their honest opinion without worrying about legal repercussions.
Absolutely. So in that sense, executive privilege is kind of like a protective shield, allowing for candid conversations and hopefully better decision-making.
Right.
But, and this is a big but, this privilege isn't absolute. Right. We've seen throughout history that there are limits to how far a president can go in claiming this privilege.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the most famous example of this has got to be Watergate.
Yeah, the Watergate scandal, and specifically the case of United States v. Nixon.
Yeah, that case really set a precedent for how we think about executive privilege.
So for those who might not remember all the details, can you just give us a quick recap of what happened?
Sure. So basically, Nixon was accused of being involved in a cover-up of a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel.
And there were tapes. Right. Recordings of conversations in the Oval Office.
Yeah, and the prosecutor wanted those tapes as evidence, but Nixon refused to hand them over, claiming executive privilege.
And what did the Supreme Court say?
Well, the court acknowledged that executive privilege does exist, but they also said that it's not absolute. They ruled that in this case, the need for evidence in a criminal trial outweighed Nixon's claim of confidentiality.
So he had to turn over the tapes.
Yep, and those tapes ultimately led to his resignation.
Wow. So that case really showed that the courts can step in and lift that security curtain of privilege when necessary.
Exactly. It established that even the president isn't above the law.
That's a really crucial point. I mean, it reinforces the idea of checks and balances.
Yeah.
That no one branch of government has unlimited power.
Right. The courts can act as a check on presidential power, especially when there's evidence of wrongdoing.
And it also raises some really interesting questions about the balance between national security and transparency.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, how do we ensure that the president has the confidentiality they need to make tough decisions, but also make sure that they're not abusing that power?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and there's no easy answer.
And, this debate continues to this day. Every time a president asserts executive privilege, it sparks a debate about the limits of presidential power.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that these aren't just theoretical concepts. They have real implications for our democracy.
Right.
Now, beyond the question of legality, there's also a debate about the arguments for and against executive privilege, right?
Yeah. I mean, even if it's legal, is it always a good thing?
Exactly. So what are some of the concerns that people have raised about this privilege?
Well, one of the main arguments against it is that it can lead to a lack of transparency and accountability.
Hmm.
If the president can keep their communications secret, it can be hard to know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and that can make it difficult to hold them accountable for their actions.
Right. It's like a shield that can be used to deflect scrutiny.
Exactly. And some people argue that this can lead to abuse of power.
Right. If there's no oversight, there's more opportunity for things to go wrong.
And, even if there's no intentional wrongdoing, this lack of transparency can still be problematic.
How so?
Well, it can make it hard to understand how decisions are being made, and it can erode public trust in the government.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah, if people feel like they're being kept in the dark, they're less likely to trust the people in power.
That makes sense. So transparency is really key to maintaining a healthy democracy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the potential downsides of executive privilege, but let's also consider the arguments in favor of it.
Okay.
Why do some people think it's important to protect this privilege?
Well, as we talked about earlier, one of the main arguments is that it's necessary for effective decision-making.
Right, that idea of fostering open communication between the president and their advisors.
Exactly. And proponents of executive privilege argue that if advisors know that their conversations could become public, they might be less likely to give their honest opinions or to offer dissenting viewpoints.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem, especially on sensitive issues.
Right. And, they also argue that this privilege can help to protect national security.
Okay, how so?
Well, imagine if the president couldn't have confidential discussions about military operations or intelligence gathering. That could put our national security at risk.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's a balance to be struck between transparency and security, right?
Exactly. It's not always easy to find that balance,
Yeah.
but it's something we need to constantly be thinking about.
Absolutely. And this is a debate that's likely to continue for as long as we have a presidency.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so we've covered executive privilege in some depth. Let's move on to our second big concept, executive immunity.
Okay.
Now, this one is a bit different. It's less about confidentiality and more about protecting the president from lawsuits.
Yeah, it's kind of like a legal shield that protects them from being sued while they're in office.
Exactly. And the idea behind this is that the president shouldn't be constantly bogged down by lawsuits, that it would distract them from their duties, and could even paralyze their ability to govern.
Right. The argument is that they need to be able to make tough decisions without fearing that they'll be sued every time someone disagrees with them.
Yeah, I can see the logic in that, but it also seems like it could be open to abuse, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why this concept has been so controversial.
So let's break it down a bit. I think it's important to understand that there are actually two types of executive immunity.
Right. There's absolute immunity and qualified immunity.
So let's start with absolute immunity. What does that mean?
Well, absolute immunity means that the president cannot be sued for actions taken while performing their official duties.
So no matter what they do.
Well, there are some limits, but basically it protects them from civil lawsuits related to their job.
And what's the rationale for this?
Well, the courts have argued that this immunity is necessary to allow the president to act decisively and without fear of reprisal.
So they're not constantly looking over their shoulder.
Exactly. And a key case here is Nixon v. Fitzgerald.
Nixon again.
Yeah, he seems to pop up a lot in these discussions.
Well, he was president during a pretty tumultuous time.
That's true. So in this case, Nixon was sued by a former government employee who claimed he was fired for political reasons.
Okay, so basically wrongful termination.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court ultimately sided with Nixon, granting him absolute immunity.
So the employee had no recourse.
Nope, the court said that allowing lawsuits like this would distract the president from their duties and could even be used to harass them.
I can see how that could be a concern.
Yeah, but it also raises questions about accountability, right?
Absolutely. I mean, what if a president does something truly egregious? Are they completely untouchable?
Well, that's where things get complicated, and that's why we have the second type of immunity, qualified immunity.
Okay, so how is qualified immunity different?
Well, qualified immunity applies to other government officials, not just the president,
Okay.
and it offers less protection than absolute immunity.
So they can be sued.
Yes, but only if they violate clearly established law.
What does that mean?
It means that they can't be sued for actions that are within the scope of their duties, even if those actions are controversial.
So there has to be a clear legal violation.
Exactly, and this standard is designed to protect government officials from frivolous lawsuits, but it also allows for accountability when they overstep their bounds.
Okay, that makes sense, but it also seems like it could be a bit tricky to determine what constitutes clearly established law.
Oh, absolutely. This is an area of law that's constantly evolving, and there's a lot of debate about how it should be applied.
Yeah, seems like there's a lot of gray area.
And this debate is especially relevant today as we see more and more cases involving police misconduct.
Right. Qualified immunity has been used to shield police officers from lawsuits in some controversial cases.
Exactly. And this has led to calls for reform of this doctrine.
So it's a really important issue with far-reaching implications.
Yeah, it's at the heart of questions about accountability and the rule of law.
Now, going back to the president, we've talked about immunity for actions taken while in office. But what about actions taken before becoming president?
Ah, that's another interesting question.
Right. Can a president be sued for something they did before they took office?
Well, that was the issue in the case of Clinton v. Jones.
Ah, yes, the Clinton case.
So in this case, Clinton was sued for alleged sexual harassment that occurred before he became president.
And what did the court say?
The court ruled that he was not immune from lawsuits for actions taken prior to taking office.
So no immunity for pre-presidency actions.
Yeah. Right. The court said that the president is not above the law and that they can be held accountable for their actions even if those actions occurred before they took office.
Wow, that's a significant ruling.
Yeah, it establishes that the presidency doesn't give you a free pass for past misconduct.
And it also raises some interesting questions about the scope of presidential power.
Absolutely. I mean, it suggests that the president is subject to the same laws as everyone else.
And that's a really important principle in a democracy.
Right. It's about ensuring that no one is above the law.
Now, this brings us to a question that's been debated for a long time. What about criminal prosecution of a sitting president?
Ah, that's a tough one.
Right? Can a sitting president be indicted?
Well, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say whether a sitting president can be criminally indicted, and there's no clear consensus on this issue.
So it's a bit of a legal gray area.
Yeah, and it's a question that's never been definitively answered by the courts.
So what are the different perspectives on this?
Well, some scholars believe that a sitting president can be indicted, arguing that no one is above the law, not even the president.
And others disagree.
Yes. Some argue that indicting a sitting president would be too disruptive to the functioning of the government.
And they also argue that it could potentially be used as a political weapon.
Exactly. So it's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
And it's something that we're likely to continue debating for a long time to come.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about executive privilege and executive immunity, both of which are really important aspects of presidential power. But we also need to consider the potential downsides of these concepts.
Right. These are powerful tools, and like any tool, they can be misused.
Exactly. So what are some of the concerns that people have raised about these protections?
Well, one of the main concerns is that they can be used to shield the president from accountability. If the president can keep their communications secret and if they're immune from lawsuits, it can be difficult to hold them responsible for their actions.
Right, it's like a double layer of protection that can make it hard to get to the truth.
Exactly. And some people argue that this can create a culture of secrecy and impunity.
And that can erode public trust in the government.
Absolutely. And it can also lead to abuse of power.
Right. If there's no accountability, there's more opportunity for corruption and wrongdoing.
And, even if there's no intentional wrongdoing, these protections can still be problematic.
How so?
Well, they can make it difficult to understand how decisions are being made, and they can create a perception that the president is above the law.
Yeah, that's not a good look for a democracy.
Definitely not. So it's really important to have a robust debate about these issues and to make sure that we have mechanisms in place to prevent abuse of power.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that these are ongoing conversations, that our understanding of presidential power is constantly evolving.
Right. It's a dynamic process.
So to wrap things up, we've explored two crucial aspects of presidential power: executive privilege and executive immunity. And we've seen how they can function as both a security curtain and a shield.
And we've also seen how these concepts are at the heart of ongoing debates about presidential power, accountability, and the balance of authority in our government.
Exactly. And these are debates that we all need to be engaged in because they have real implications for our democracy.
Absolutely. Informed civic engagement is essential to a healthy democracy.
So as you continue to think about these issues, I want to leave you with a question. What mechanisms exist to ensure that presidents don't misuse their shield of immunity? It's something to ponder as we navigate the complexities of executive power in a democratic society.
It's a question worth asking.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It was a pleasure being here.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.
Bye. Bye.